7 minutes before midnight, in the black water off the north coast of Japan, a small American submarine was chasing something far larger than herself. The war was already over. Japan had surrendered 2 weeks before. But out here, in the empty ocean east of Honshu, the news had not quite settled, and the men aboard the submarine Segundo were about to meet the strangest thing any of them had ever seen at sea. At 53 minutes past 10 on the night of the 28th of August, 1945, her radar caught it. A large contact on the surface, thousands of yards off, moving through the swell. The Segundo swung to close the range, and as she crept in to under 2,000 yards, her lookouts made out a shape that did not make sense. It was a submarine, but it was a submarine the size of a cruiser, longer than a football field, with a great slab-sided tower rising off its deck like a barn dropped onto a boat. Nobody aboard had ever been told that such a thing could exist, and it was running. 15 knots on the surface, holding course away from them, refusing to answer, trying to lose the little American boat in the night. The Segundo was an ordinary fleet submarine. The thing ahead of her weighed 3 times what she did. If it turned to fight, or dived, or simply took itself and everyone aboard down to the bottom, there was very little one American boat could do to stop it. Her captain was a lieutenant commander named Johnson on his first patrol in command. His problem, in the small hours of that morning, was to make a machine far bigger than his own stop and give itself up, without any idea of what was inside it or what its crew meant to do. He got it to stop. A little after 4 in the morning, he sent the order to halt across in international code, and to his surprise, the huge submarine answered and slowed and lay there wallowing in the swell. But stopping it was the easy part. For the next 2 days, the two submarines circled each other in a slow, wary dance, while officers went back and forth by rubber boat across the water between them, trying to arrange a surrender in a language neither side really shared. One American who was there described the negotiation dryly as a doubtful conversation carried on in baby talk and violent gestures. And little by little, the Americans began to understand that they had caught something the war had been hiding. Then, on the morning the American flag was finally raised over the captured boat, a message came across from the officer they had put aboard her. A senior man, someone higher than her own captain, someone the Americans had not even known was on the ship, had just killed himself below decks. His body was already wrapped and gone into the sea. No one had seen it. The report the Segundo's captain wrote afterward put it plainly. The whole thing sounded false to them. Something was badly wrong aboard this submarine, and the men who had caught it were standing on the deck of the largest submarine ever built. It had been made to do something no submarine had ever done. It had been made to cross half the world underwater, surface off the coast of the United States, and send bombers into the American sky. It never fired a shot in anger. And within a year, the same US Navy that had hunted it down would take this prize it had chased across an ocean, tow it out into deep water, and sink it on purpose so that no one else on Earth would ever be allowed to look inside it. The men standing on her deck that morning had just captured the most secret machine of the entire war. Almost none of them yet knew what it was. The Japanese Navy called it the Sen-Toku type. The name was short for a phrase that meant roughly special submarine, and for once the word special was earned. She was over 400 feet long. On the surface, she displaced more than 5,000 tons and submerged a good deal more than that, which made her better than twice the size of the ordinary submarines hunting each other across the Pacific. She would remain the largest submarine ever built for the next 20 years, until the nuclear missile boats of the 1960s finally passed her. And she was not simply a bigger version of an ordinary boat. Almost everything about her was strange. Her hull, in cross-section, was not a single tube, but a figure 8. 2 great cylinders welded side by side, because a single circle of steel could not have been made strong enough at that size. Her conning tower was pushed off to one side, over to port, to make room down the middle of her back for the thing that made her what she was. She carried cables strung along her hull to sweep aside magnetic mines. and she was coated, hull and tower, in a special covering meant to soak up the pulses of enemy sonar and soften the echo she threw back, an early crude attempt to make a submarine harder to hear beneath the surface. None of it made her invisible, but all of it, taken together, told you that her designers had been reaching for something no one had built before. Because the Sen-Toku was not really a submarine at all, in the way anyone then understood the word. She was an underwater aircraft carrier. Running along her back, built into the deck behind that offset tower, was a great watertight steel cylinder more than 100 feet long and 11 feet across. It was a hangar, and folded up inside it, wings turned and tails dropped down, packed away like tools in a case, were 3 bombers. Picture what she was built to do. She would run submerged toward an enemy coast, surface in the night, and in the space of a few minutes her crew would swing open the hangar door, roll the first bomber out onto rails, spread its folded wings, lock them, set it on a catapult built into her foredeck, and fling it into the sky. Then the second, then the third. 3 aircraft off the deck and climbing, and the whole enormous boat sliding back under the waves. All of it done fast enough that anyone watching from the shore would be left staring at empty water, wondering if they had seen anything at all. But getting the aircraft off was only half of it, and it was the easy half. The far harder problem was getting them back. A Seiran that survived its mission had to find its own submarine again somewhere in the open ocean, come down on the water beside her on its floats, and be lifted back aboard by a folding crane while the boat lay stopped and helpless on the surface. A 400-foot target in plain view of anyone with eyes or radar. It could only be done in calm water, and it ate up long minutes, every one of them spent motionless on top of the sea. Deep down, everyone involved understood the truth of it. In any real attack against a real enemy, the planes would almost certainly be flying one way. That was the secret the American boarding party was standing on top of, and did not yet fully grasp. When the navigator of the captured boat came across to the Segundo, he could not quite hide his pride in her. He told the Americans about her, boasted a little in the way of a man showing off a thing he had loved. He told them how fast she could dive, 1 minute and 10 seconds to take all of that steel under. He told them how deep she could go and how far she could run, more than 30,000 miles without ever touching a port, 1.5 times around the entire planet, and come home. He told them she carried 200 men. There was nowhere on Earth, he was saying, without quite saying it, that this boat could not reach. And that was the whole point of her. That was the idea a desperate navy had poured its last strength into. A submarine that could carry its own air force to any coastline in the world, rise up out of the sea without warning, throw its aircraft into the sky, and vanish again before anyone knew it had been there. The men who built her had a target in mind when they started. The target was America. The idea was born out of the worst kind of confidence, in the weeks right after Pearl Harbor. The architect of that attack, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, understood something his own government kept trying to forget. Japan could not win a long war against the United States. Her only hope was to hit so hard and so shockingly that America would lose its appetite for the fight. Pearl Harbor was supposed to be that shock. When it was not, Yamamoto went looking for the next one. And late in 1941, he began to sketch out something that sounded like a fever dream. A fleet of enormous submarines that could carry bombers across an entire ocean and strike the American mainland itself. New York, Washington, the cities the Japanese people had been told were forever beyond the enemy's reach, and that the Americans had assumed were beyond Japan's. Yamamoto himself did not live to see any of it. In the spring of 1943, American codebreakers pulled his travel schedule out of an intercepted signal, and American fighters were waiting in the sky over the Solomon Islands to ambush his plane and send it down into the jungle. There is a hard irony in it. The admiral who dreamed of a secret weapon that would strike America out of nowhere was himself killed because the Americans had quietly broken his codes and could read his mail. He was dead 2 years before the first of his underwater carriers ever put to sea. His dream outlived him, and as it went, it shrank. Because to build it at all, Japan needed two things that did not yet exist. It needed the giant submarines, and it needed an aircraft that could fold up small enough to live inside one. That aircraft became the Seiran. The name meant, poetically, storm from a clear sky, and it was a small, elegant float-plane bomber designed for one impossible job. It had to disappear. Its wings were built to rotate at the root and fold flat back against the body. Its tail folded down. Its floats came off. Stripped and folded, the whole aircraft shrank down to something narrow enough to slide into that 11-foot tube. And because a cold engine is a slow engine, and every second on the surface was a second closer to death, the Japanese built a system to circulate heated oil through the Seiran's engine while it was still stowed away, so that the moment it was rolled out, it was already warm and ready to fly. A well-drilled crew of 4 could pull a Seiran out of the hangar, spread its wings, set it on the catapult, and launch it in about 7 minutes. All 3 could be airborne in under an hour, and the boat gone under a few minutes after that. Everything about these ships was built around a single surfacing. Come up unseen, off a coast that thought itself safe. Launch. Get back under before the enemy could react. It was a weapon designed around surprise the way a knife is designed around its edge. And there was one more detail, a small one, that tells you exactly what kind of war the people who planned this were prepared to fight. The Seirans that would carry it out were to be painted in American markings. Stars on the wings, the insignia of the enemy, so that a plane wearing the wrong colors might be waved through, might buy a few extra minutes of confusion over the target before the bombs fell. It is, under the laws of war, a straightforward crime, the kind of thing men were prosecuted for after 1945, and it fit because the man chosen to command these boats into action was already, by then, a criminal several times over. His name was Tatsunosuke Ariazumi, and to the men who had crossed his path and lived, he was known by a simpler name, the Butcher. Earlier in the war, Ariazumi had commanded a submarine in the Indian Ocean, and he had used it to wage a particular kind of war on the merchant cruise he sank. In the spring of 1944, his boat torpedoed a steamer called the Giselak and forced her survivors up onto his deck, close to 100 men, and had them killed. He did not simply give the order and look away. He took part in it himself. A handful of men lived only by throwing themselves back into the sea and hiding among the floating dead until he had gone. He did the same thing to the survivors of another ship some months later. By the end, the story of the submarine officer who massacred the men he had already defeated had traveled far enough that the Allies had a name waiting for him if they ever caught him. This was the man Japan chose to lead its most secret weapon into action. And it was not really a contradiction. By 1945, the whole project had taken on the logic of a navy with nothing left to lose. The Sen-Toku boats were the children of a service that was running out of fuel, out of ships, out of trained pilots, out of time, and increasingly out of any line it was not willing to cross to buy one more shock, one more headline, one more day of the war. You can read that collapse in the numbers alone. Japan had once planned a fleet of 18 of these underwater carriers, enough to hold an entire enemy coastline at risk at once. As the shipyards were bombed and the steel ran short and the months ran out, that number was cut, and cut again, until in the end only 3 of the true giants were ever finished. The weapon that had been imagined as a whole squadron, capable of terrorizing the American coast, had shrunk by the time it finally put to sea to a pair of boats and 6 aircraft. The dream had not gotten any smaller. Everything needed to make it real had simply run out. Under Ariazumi, the first squadron came together at the start of 1945. 2 of the giants, the I-400 and the I-401, each carrying 3 Seirans, along with a pair of smaller aircraft-carrying boats. His pilots trained through the spring for a mission almost none of them expected to survive. They practiced in quiet coves along the Japanese coast, launching and recovering again and again, timing themselves down to the minute against the day they would have only minutes. They were the tip of a spear that had been forged at enormous cost by a country that could no longer really afford spears at all. And the whole apparatus was aimed still at the far side of the world. Then, that summer, the target changed. For most of its life, the plan had a single objective, and it was not a city. It was a ditch. The Panama Canal was one of the most important stretches of water in the entire American War. A vast share of what the United States shipped from its factories to the Pacific had to pass through that single crossing. Cut it, and you did not just sink a ship. You closed a supply line that ran the length of a hemisphere for months. The Japanese planners studied the canal carefully and settled on the Garten locks, the great steps of concrete and steel that lift ships up and over the isthmus. Break those gates, they reasoned, and Lake Garten would drain itself out into the sea, and the canal would be useless until they could be rebuilt. They trained for it obsessively. In a quiet bay on the coast of Japan, the crews built a full-scale model of the Garten locks and flew practice runs against it after dark again and again, until the pilots could find the gates in their sleep. The plan was to send in the Seirans low, some with torpedoes and some with bombs, and blow the lock gates open. And then, in June, with Okinawa falling and American bombers burning Japanese cities one by one, the High Command looked at the map and decided that Panama was a luxury they could no longer afford. The canal was too far, and the war was too close, and it was coming home. They cancelled the Panama strike. Ariazumi, who had trained his men for it for months, protested. It made no difference. They did not cancel the mission, they only brought it closer and made it darker. The new target was a place called Ulithi, a vast, sheltered lagoon in the western Pacific that the American fleet had turned into the greatest naval anchorage on Earth. On any given night, it held aircraft carriers and battleships and hundreds of support ships packed in at their moorings. The whole enormous engine of the American advance sitting still in one place, refueling and rearming for the next push toward Japan. It was, from the Japanese point of view, the richest target imaginable and one of the most heavily guarded. The plan, codenamed Storm, was to send the Seirans in against those anchored carriers. And this time there would be no pretense that the pilots were coming home. They would fly their planes straight down into the American flight decks. The men were told to expect a one-way flight. They were young, and they were being asked to spend their lives for a gesture. At a point in the war when even the men giving the order must have known that a handful of aircraft could not change the outcome of anything. To steady them for it, and to sharpen their eyes for a night attack, they were even to be given injections before they flew. 2 submarines, 6 aircraft, 6 pilots already counted among the dead, thrown against the largest concentration of naval power the world had ever assembled. And the giants were not going alone. Ahead of them, 2 smaller aircraft-carrying submarines were to run to a forward island base and fly off fast reconnaissance planes to find the anchorage first and fix exactly where the carriers lay, so the strike would not be thrown away against empty water. It was an elaborate, carefully staged plan. It was also already coming apart. One of those 2 scout boats never reached her station at all. She was caught on the way out and sunk with every man aboard, weeks before the attack that would now never happen. The operation had been designed for a navy at the height of its power, and it was being carried out by the last splinters of one that was coming to pieces. The boat sailed in the last week of July, out into the Pacific, running for the launch point. They were, by the reckoning of their own crews, only a couple of days from throwing their planes into the sky over the American anchorage. They never got the chance. Along the way, the war ended in front of them. The voyage out was cursed almost from the start. The I-401 ran aground the moment she left port, freed herself, and then, the very next day, dragged her stern across a mine an American bomber had dropped in the strait, damaging her before she had even properly begun. She limped back for repairs. And later, out on the passage north, she nearly died at the hands of her own side. Threading a narrow strait after dark, she was spotted by 2 Japanese Army coastal batteries, who took the huge, unfamiliar silhouette for an American submarine and opened fire on her with heavy guns. The largest warship of her kind in the world had to crash dive to escape her own country's artillery. because no one had thought to tell the men on the shore that she existed. It is a small, bitter picture of the whole enterprise. A weapon so secret that it was very nearly sunk by the people it was built to protect. Then, on the 15th of August, out in the empty Pacific, the radios brought word that the Emperor had spoken and that the war was over. The senior officers aboard refused to believe it. It had to be an enemy trick, they decided, a broadcast meant to make them lower their guard at the last moment. They pressed on toward Ulithi. For days they steamed toward a fight that no longer existed, until at last the orders came through in a form they could not argue with. The attack was cancelled. Turn for home. Even then, some of the crew did not want to obey. They pressed their officers to run for the Japanese base at Truk instead, and go on fighting rather than accept that it was over. There were men aboard who would rather have died attacking something than lived having surrendered. What happened next aboard the IR-401 was a quiet war fought entirely between two men. Arizumi, the butcher, was the commander of the whole submarine squadron, riding aboard the II-401 as the most senior officer present, though the boat herself was not his to command. He wanted to keep faith with the death he had promised himself and his men. He wanted to run the boat to a lonely stretch of coast and scuttle her there and take her and her secrets to the bottom rather than hand them to the enemy. But the boat had her own captain, a younger officer named Nambu, and Nambu had a direct order from Tokyo to surrender his submarine, and he meant to obey it. The two of them argued over the fate of the boat and every man aboard her, the war criminal who wanted to die and the captain who had decided to live. And in the end, Nambu won, because Nambu was holding the last lawful order the Empire would ever give. They did as the surrender terms demanded, and it must have been a strange and shameful thing to do to a ship they had loved. They ran their three bombers up out of the hangar one last time, and without pilots, without ceremony, catapulted them off empty into the sea, and watched their secret weapons splash down and sink. They dumped the bombs over the side. They fired off their torpedoes into open water. They burned their codes and their charts and their logs. They stripped the boat of everything that made her what she was, until she was only a very large, very strange machine, wandering an ocean that no longer had a war in it. She was not the only one. Out on the same empty sea, her sister the I-400 was going through the same bitter ritual. And a day before the Segundo ever found the I-401, an American patrol plane spotted the I-400 running on the surface under a black flag of surrender, and two American destroyers, the Blue and the Mansfield, closed in and took her, 500 miles from Tokyo. The giants were coming in one by one out of a war that no longer wanted them. And a few nights later, a small American submarine found the I-401 on radar in the dark. What followed was the meeting we began with, and it deserves to be told the way the Americans wrote it down at the time, because they were careful men and they did not embroider it. For the better part of 2 days after the Segundo first made her stop, the two submarines shadowed each other while their officers went back and forth by boat. The captured giant was identified at last for what she was. The I-401, the flagship of a class the Americans had barely known existed. When the boarding party of 6 Americans, led by a lieutenant named Balson, went aboard the huge submarine, the Japanese crew met them with a small, almost human courtesy. A gift, a bottle of Suntory whiskey pressed on the men who had come to take their ship. The Americans took it. Then they chained the hatches open so the boat could not dive and got on with the work. And the work carried its own danger. When it became clear that the Japanese were still using their radio, quietly to talk to someone ashore, Balson went down inside the enemy submarine, alone, into the belly of a boat crewed by 200 men who had until very recently intended to die fighting, and pulled the transmitter tubes out with his own hands. Then he came back up. It is worth stopping on that for a moment. The war was over, and men were still climbing down alone into the guts of an enemy hull, not knowing what was waiting at the bottom of the ladder. On the second morning, the American commander went across himself to settle the final terms. The captain of the U401, Nambu, met him on the deck of his own ruined command, and the first thing he said, in careful, broken English, was not a plea and not a threat. It was an apology. "I am sorry you come." They agreed the formal surrender would take place the next day, and the next day, when the American flag was hoisted over the I-401 at 5 o'clock in the morning, the word came across almost at once that the senior officer aboard, the one no American had known was even there, had shot himself below decks during the night. Ariazumi was gone. His crew had wrapped his body and given it to the sea before any American laid eyes on it. The men of the Segundo, reading the situation, wrote down honestly that the whole thing sounded false to them, that they did not entirely trust what they were being told, that until that moment they had not even known a man senior to the captain was aboard. But no body was ever produced, and the butcher was never made to answer for the men he had murdered in the Indian Ocean. He had found the one way out that no court could follow. The great submarine was taken in, escorted through the last strange days of the war's end, and brought at last to anchor among the ships of the very navy she had been built to burn. There is a small, sharp irony in who inherited her. The officer eventually put in charge of sailing the captured I-401 across the Pacific to Pearl Harbor was a submariner named Edward Spruance. His father was Admiral Raymond Spruance, whose fleet had been the target waiting at Ulithi, the very anchorage the I-401's bombers had trained and expected to die attacking. The son sailed the monster home. When the captured giants came into Pearl Harbor at the start of 1946, a Navy band was waiting on the dock to meet them, and a small crowd gathered to look at the enormous, impossible submarines that had been built to bomb America and had ended up tied to an American pier. Then the engineers went aboard and took the giants apart with their eyes. They went over every inch of them. They ran the boats out on trials, tested that strange figure-eight hull and that great hangar, and ran radar experiments with the captured submarines to learn what they could do. They marveled at a submarine that could carry an air raid in its belly. The American crews who had sailed the boats across the Pacific had already noticed grudgingly how well those huge double hulls rode in a heavy sea, how steady they stayed when smaller boats were being thrown around. There was real respect in it. Whatever else they had been, these were remarkable machines, unlike anything else then afloat, and every man who crawled through them knew it, which is exactly what made them dangerous, even now, even beaten and disarmed and flying another country's flag, because the shooting war was over, and a colder one was already taking shape in the silence between the United States and the Soviet Union. Under the agreements that had ended the fighting, the Soviets had the right to send their own inspectors to examine captured enemy equipment. And it began to dawn on the US Navy that if the Soviet inspectors came to Pearl Harbor and were allowed aboard these boats, they would be handed a complete education in the most advanced submarine design on Earth. The very thing that made the Sen-Toku boats a marvel, that they were a generation ahead of their time, was now the reason no one else could be permitted to study them. So, the Navy made a cold decision. In the spring of 1946, orders went out to destroy every captured Japanese submarine, and to do it quickly. The end came off the coast of Oahu, in water more than a quarter of a mile deep. The submarine that had been dreamed up to bomb New York, that had trained against a model of the Panama Canal, that had been ordered to die over Ulithi, that had run halfway across an ocean and surrendered rather than fight, was towed out to sea one last time. Not as a warship now, but as a target. On the morning of the 31st of May, 1946, an American submarine put 2 torpedoes into the I-401, and just before 11 o'clock she went down by the stern into deep water off Pearl Harbor. Her sister, the I-400, followed her to the bottom a few days later, sunk by 3 torpedoes from another American boat, with 2 senior American submariners standing on deck to watch her go. The prize the Navy had chased across the Pacific, it now hid on the floor of the ocean on purpose, in water too deep to reach, where no ally and no enemy could ever look inside her again. The largest submarine ever built had drawn no blood at all. It had crossed no ocean in anger, dropped no bomb, sunk no ship, killed no one. It had been imagined as the shock that would break America's will, and it broke nothing. And in the end, the only people it truly unsettled were the ones who had captured it. This beaten and empty machine still carried secrets they were not willing to share with anyone, and rather than let another navy learn them, they sent it to the bottom. For almost 60 years, that was where the story stopped. Two enormous machines, lying somewhere off Hawaii, their exact graves known only to the men who had sunk them, and slowly forgotten by everyone else. Then the deep-sea explorers came looking. In 2005, a research submersible from a Hawaii laboratory, working along the slope off the south coast of Oahu, more than half a mile down, came upon the I-401 sitting upright on the bottom. Her bow had broken away and lay a little apart from the rest of her, joined to the hull by a long trail of scattered wreckage. But the great body of her was intact, and the tall tower stood where it had always stood. And when the lights of the submersible swept across the side of that conning tower, there, still perfectly legible after 60 years in the cold and the dark, was her name. I-401. Her anti-aircraft guns still stood on her deck in almost pristine condition, as though she had gone down only the week before. 8 years later, in 2013, the same explorers found her sister, the I-400, further along the slope, her hull torn open and half collapsed, the ocean slowly taking her apart. The two largest submarines the world had ever built, lying a few miles and a few years apart on the sea floor, exactly where their captors had meant for them to stay lost. There is one last survivor of all of it, and it did not stay on the bottom of the sea. When the war ended, a single Seiran, the very last airframe ever built, was handed over to the Americans and flown down to surrender. It was shipped across the Pacific, sat forgotten in storage for decades, and was at last painstakingly restored. Today, it hangs whole and gleaming in a museum just outside Washington, D.C. The little bomber that was built to be catapulted off a submarine in the dark and thrown at American cities is now a quiet exhibit, a short drive from the capital it was meant to burn, walked past by families who have never once heard its name. It is worth asking what all of it was for. The Sen-Toku program devoured a fortune in steel and fuel and engineering talent that Japan, by the end, did not have to spare. At the very moment her cities were burning and her people were beginning to starve. It produced 3 magnificent, useless ships. Not one of them ever fired on an enemy. The thousands of hours of training, the secret bay, the full-size model of the Panama Canal, the young pilots who had made their peace with death, all of it ended with 3 bombers shoved off a deck into an empty sea, and a captain apologizing in broken English to the men who had come to take his boat. Measured against what it cost, it may be the most expensive weapon of the entire war that never once drew blood. And yet the idea behind it did not die when the boats went to the bottom. Strip away the folding wings and the catapult and all the Baroque machinery of it, and what Yamamoto had been reaching for was a single, simple, terrible notion. A vessel that could cross an ocean unseen, rise up out of nowhere, deal a devastating blow against an enemy's homeland, and disappear before anyone could answer. Within 20 years, that notion would become the most important weapon on Earth. It would carry a missile instead of a float plane, and it would be built and aimed by the very nation the US Navy had sunk the I-400s to keep them away from. The submarine that could hold a country's cities hostage from beneath the sea was coming. The Japanese had simply been the first to reach for it, a generation too early, with the wrong tools, at the end of the wrong war. That is what became of the largest submarines the world had ever seen. They were the last strange gamble of a navy that had run out of every other kind of hope, a weapon of enormous ambition and no result, hunted down and captured at night by a boat a third their size, and then hidden away by their own captors precisely because they were too good to share. The men who chased that shape through the water off the coast of Japan never did quite trust what they had found. They were right not to. They had caught the future of naval warfare, built by the wrong hands at the wrong hour, for a war that had already ended. And they did the only thing that made sense to them. They took it out into deep water, and they let the sea keep the secret. One last thing. Almost none of the names in this account come from a textbook. They come from the report the Segundo's crew typed up at sea in the last days of the war, from ship's logs and muster rolls and the surrender papers themselves. The paper record of a night that history very nearly filed away and forgot. If you had family in the Pacific Submarine Force, aboard the Segundo, or the Cabazon, or the Trumpetfish, or one of the destroyers that brought these giants in, we would count it a privilege to know their name. Leave it below so that it does not slip away with everything else the sea was told to keep.